Between 1866 and 1886, over 10 million cattle were driven north from Texas to railheads in Kansas and beyond. Cowboys spent 3 months in the saddle eating whatever a single wagon could carry across 800 miles of open prairie. No refrigeration, no grocery stores, no fresh vegetables for weeks at a time. Yet the meals that came off those chuck wagons were so effective at keeping men alive and working 18-hour days that the U.S. Army studied them. Number 14 on this list has a name so vulgar most trail bosses refuse to say it in front of women, but it was the most nutritious thing a cowboy ever ate. And number 7 was invented by accident when a cook dropped something he should not have into a Dutch oven. These are the 30 meals that fueled the greatest migration of livestock in American history. Before we start, hit that subscribe button because some of these recipes deserve a comeback. Number 30. Hardtack and coffee. Before the chuck wagon even rolled out of Texas, every cowboy carried hardtack in his saddlebag. These brick-hard squares of flour and water, baked until every trace of moisture was gone, could survive months of heat, rain, and rough handling without spoiling. The Army had issued them during the Civil War, and most trail hands knew them by a dozen unflattering names: worm castles, sheet iron, tooth dullers. The trick was dunking it in boiling coffee until it softened enough to chew, creating a thick, starchy mush that sat heavy in the stomach and kept hunger quiet through a long morning in the saddle. A 50-pound crate cost about $2 and lasted the whole drive. Cowboys did not love hardtack. They endured it. But in the first days out of camp, before the cook had time to set up a proper kitchen, it was the difference between riding hungry and riding fed. That was enough. Number 29. Arbuckle's coffee. No single item mattered more to a cattle drive than coffee. Cowboys drank it at dawn, at noon, and again after nightfall. Arbuckle Brothers out of Pittsburgh had revolutionized the business by selling pre-roasted beans in sealed 1-pound bags, each coated in a glaze of egg and sugar to preserve freshness. Before Arbuckles, trail cooks had to roast green beans in a skillet over an open flame, burning half the batch and filling camp with bitter smoke. Now the cook just cracked open a bag, crushed the beans with a rifle butt or the flat of an axe, and boiled them in a gallon pot until the coffee turned black enough to float a horseshoe. That was the test. If a horseshoe sank, it was not ready. A single bag cost about 15 cents and brewed enough for a dozen men. The cook would holler, "Who wants the candy?" because every bag of Arbuckles came with a peppermint stick, and whoever volunteered to grind the beans earned the sweet. For 3 months straight, that coffee was the only comfort some men had. Number 28. Sourdough biscuits. The chuck wagon cook, called a cookie by the crew, carried a sourdough starter in a wooden keg lashed to the side of the wagon. That starter was alive, a culture of wild yeast and bacteria that had to be fed flour and water every single day, or it died. Some starters were years old, passed from cook to cook like a family heirloom. Every morning before dawn, the cookie would pull a fistful of starter, mix it with flour, a pinch of salt, and a spoonful of lard, then bake the biscuits in a Dutch oven buried in hot coals. The result was golden, slightly tangy, and tender enough to pull apart with your fingers. A good biscuit maker earned more respect than a good roper. Trail bosses paid top cooks up to $60 a month, more than the cowboys themselves earned, because a crew that ate well worked harder and complained less. Bad biscuits could start a mutiny faster than bad pay. Number 27. Fried salt pork was the backbone of the chuck wagon pantry. Slabs of pork belly cured in heavy salt could last months without refrigeration, packed in wooden barrels and buried under flour sacks to stay cool. The cook would slice it thick, soak the slices in water to draw out some of the brine, then fry them in a cast iron skillet until the edges crisped and the fat rendered golden. Eaten with sourdough biscuits and black coffee, Fried salt pork was breakfast more mornings than not. The leftover grease went into everything else the cook made that day. Nothing was wasted. A barrel of salt pork cost about $12 and fed a crew of 10 for weeks. Cowboys called it "so belly," and while nobody dreamed about it, every man cleaned his plate. Number 26, red beans. Dried pinto beans traveled beautifully. Lightweight, nearly indestructible, and packed with enough protein to keep a man upright in the saddle for hours. The cook would soak them overnight in a pot hung from the side of the wagon, then simmer them all day while the herd moved, the pot nestled in a box of hot coals in the wagon bed. By supper time, those beans had turned soft and creamy, seasoned with salt pork, onion, and whatever chili peppers the cook had dried back in Texas. A 100-pound sack of pintos cost less than $4 and could stretch across an entire drive. Beans showed up at nearly every supper for 3 months straight. Cowboys joked about the consequences, but nobody turned down a second helping. The fiber and iron in those beans kept men going when the meat ran low and the trail stretched long. Number 25, son of a gun stew. When a calf was slaughtered on the trail, nothing went to waste. The cook would take the tongue, heart, liver, kidneys, sweetbreads, and marrow gut, dice everything into rough chunks, and simmer the lot in a Dutch oven with onions and salt for hours. The marrow gut, which is the tube connecting a calf's two stomachs, gave the stew a rich, almost creamy texture that no other ingredient could replicate. This was the cowboy's most complete meal, packed with iron, vitamins, and fat that a body burning 5,000 calories a day desperately needed. The stew had another name too, one that referenced a female dog and the man who owned her, used when no polite company was within earshot. Trail diaries from the 1870s mention it more than any other dish. A single calf could produce enough organ meat to feed the entire crew for 2 days. Son of a gun stew was crude, filling, and proof that waste was a sin no trail cook would commit. Number 24, corn dodgers. When flour ran low between supply stops, the cook turned to cornmeal. Corn dodgers were nothing more than cornmeal mixed with water, a little salt, and maybe a spoonful of bacon grease, shaped into small oval cakes and fried in a skillet or baked on a flat stone near the fire. They came out dense and gritty with a toasted corn flavor that paired well with beans and stew. A 20-pound sack of cornmeal cost about $1 and took up almost no space in the wagon. Cowboys ate corn dodgers by the handful, stuffing them in shirt pockets for the long afternoon stretch between dinner and supper. They were not pretty. They were not soft, but they kept a man chewing and his stomach full when the biscuit flour was gone and the next town was still 3 days away. Number 23, beef jerky. Every drive carried strips of beef that had been salted, peppered, and dried in the Texas sun until they turned dark and stiff as leather. Jerky was trail insurance, the food you reached for when there was no time to stop and cook. A cowboy on night watch could chew a strip for an hour, the salt and protein keeping him alert while the herd settled under the stars. The meat was sliced thin against the grain, rubbed with salt, and sometimes a little chili powder, then hung over mesquite smoke for days. 5 pounds of fresh beef shrank down to about 1 pound of jerky, concentrated fuel that weighed almost nothing in a saddlebag. Some outfits carried 50 pounds or more, enough to survive if the wagon broke down or a river crossing went wrong. Jerky tasted like work, tough, salty, relentless, but it kept men alive when nothing else could. Number 22, spotted pup. Rice boiled with raisins and a pour of molasses became the trail's most common dessert, and the cowboys called it spotted pup for the way the dark raisins dotted the pale rice like spots on a dog. The cook would simmer rice until tender, stir in a handful of dried raisins and enough cane molasses to turn the whole pot a sticky amber brown. Served warm from the Dutch oven, spotted pup was sweet enough to feel like a reward after 12 hours of dust and cattle. A 50-pound sack of rice cost about $3 and lasted weeks. Raisins and molasses traveled without spoiling. The whole dessert could be assembled in 20 minutes with no skill required. For men who had not tasted anything sweet in days, that first spoonful of spotted pup was something close to joy. Number 21, Pan de Campo. Texas trail cooks with Mexican heritage carried a flatbread tradition that predated the cattle drives by centuries. Pan de Campo was made from flour, lard, salt, and water, kneaded quickly and cooked in a Dutch oven or directly on a flat rock beside the fire. The bread puffed slightly as it baked, developing a golden crust with a soft, chewy interior that tore apart in thick pieces. It was sturdier than a biscuit and more forgiving of rough handling, making it perfect for stuffing in a pocket alongside jerky for the long ride ahead. Mexican vaqueros had been making pan de campo on cattle ranges since the 1700s, and Anglo cowboys adopted it without hesitation because it was simply better trail bread. A good cook could turn out enough to feed 10 men in under 30 minutes. Number 20, fried steak and cream gravy. When the crew slaughtered a steer on the trail, the cook would cut steaks from the tougher portions, pound them thin with the back of a cleaver, dredge them in flour, and fry them in a cast iron skillet filled with sizzling lard. The result was chicken fried steak, though nobody called it that until decades later. After the meat came out, the cook would stir flour into the pan drippings, add canned milk or water, and scrape up every brown bit stuck to the iron. That gravy, peppered heavily and poured over the steak and a pile of biscuits, was the finest meal the trail could offer. Cowboys fought for seconds. The combination of crispy fried meat and thick peppery gravy delivered enough calories and fat to fuel a man through a full day of hard riding. This was celebration food, served only when fresh beef was available, and every man remembered the nights it appeared. Number 19, stewed dried apples. Dried fruit was one of the few sources of vitamins on the trail, and apples were the most common. The cook would soak a few handfuls of dried apple rings in water for an hour, then simmer them with sugar or molasses until they turned soft and syrupy. Served warm alongside biscuits or spooned over spotted pup. Stewed apples cut through the monotony of salt and grease that defined most trail meals. A 5-pound bag of dried apples cost about 40 cents and provided enough fruit for a week of desserts. Cowboys craved them, and a cook who ran out of dried fruit before the drive ended heard about it every night. Number 18, bear sign. On rare occasions, when the cook was feeling generous or the trail boss wanted to boost morale, the cookie would make bear sign. Donuts, real honest donuts fried in deep fat until golden brown and rolled in sugar. The dough was simple: flour, eggs if they had them, sugar and lard, cut into rough rings and dropped into a pot of boiling grease. They came out hot, crisp on the outside and soft within, dusted with whatever sweetener was on hand. A crew that learned bear sign was on the menu would race back to camp like the herd was on fire. Trail boss Charles Goodnight reportedly said, "A cook who could make good bear sign was worth his weight in gold." The treat was so prized that cowboys on neighboring drives would ride miles out of their way just to beg a few from a generous cookie. Number 17, chili con carne. Texas cowboys carried dried chili peppers the way sailors carried limes. The cook would toast the peppers over flame, grind them with a little cumin and garlic, and simmer the paste with chunks of beef in a heavy pot for hours. No beans, no tomatoes, just meat, fat, chilies, and thyme. The result was a thick, fiery stew that burned going down and warmed a man from the inside out on cold prairie nights. Chili was medicine as much as food. The capsaicin cleared congested lungs, the fat fueled hard labor, and the heat masked the taste of beef that was not exactly fresh. A pot of chili could stretch a small amount of meat into enough supper for a full crew, and the leftovers improved overnight, growing richer and deeper as the flavors melded around the dying coals. Number 16. Vinegar pie. When lemons were impossible and eggs were scarce, the trail cook made pie from what he had. Vinegar, sugar, flour, a little butter, and water were mixed into a filling that baked into something tangy, sweet, and surprisingly close to lemon custard. The crust was basic flour and lard, rolled out on the wagon's drop-down table and pressed into a skillet. Vinegar pie was desperation baking at its finest, a dessert conjured from pantry staples that could survive a 3-month journey without spoiling. Most cowboys had no idea what made it taste so bright and sharp. They just knew it was the closest thing to real pie they would eat until the drive ended. The recipe showed up in chuck wagon cook journals from the 1870s onward, always noted with pride, as if creating something delicious from almost nothing was a skill worth recording. Number 15. Prairie butter. When real butter melted in the Texas heat, on the second day out, the cook rendered beef marrow from soup bones, whipped it smooth, and served it as a spread for biscuits. Cowboys called it prairie butter, and while it lacked the sweetness of the real thing, the rich, beefy fat melted into warm bread in a way that was deeply satisfying. Marrow was free, since every slaughtered steer produced pounds of it, and the cook simply cracked the leg bones, scooped the soft center, and worked it with a fork until spreadable. Some cooks added a pinch of salt. Others mixed in a little molasses for sweetness. Prairie butter was the trail's answer to a problem every drive faced, keeping bread edible without the one ingredient that could not survive the heat. Number 14. Calf fries. When young bulls were castrated on the trail, which happened often because steers were easier to manage than bulls, the cook collected the discarded organs, sliced them thin, battered them in flour and cornmeal, and fried them crisp in deep fat. Cowboys called them calf fries, mountain oysters, or prairie oysters, depending on where they were from, and most men ate them with enthusiasm, born from genuine hunger. Sliced thin and fried hot, they were tender, mild, and almost creamy inside the crunchy shell. Served with salt and a splash of vinegar, calf fries were a trail delicacy, one of the few fresh foods available between supply stops. The cook who wasted them was considered a fool. The cook who seasoned them well was considered an artist. Number 13. Cowboy beans and rice. When the meat ran low, the cook combined whatever beans had been simmering all day with boiled rice, creating a dish that provided complete protein without a single scrap of beef. Seasoned with salt pork drippings, a dried chili pepper, and a fistful of wild onion. If any grew nearby, beans and rice was the vegetarian meal cowboys never called vegetarian. It sat heavy in the stomach and kept a man working through the long afternoon. The combination showed up in trail diaries as a staple of lean weeks when the herd could not spare a steer, and the supply wagon had not arrived. No cowboy ever praised it. Every cowboy ate it. Number 12. Soda biscuits. When the sourdough starter died, and it sometimes did in extreme heat or cold, the cook fell back on baking soda biscuits that needed no yeast at all. Flour, baking soda, salt, lard, and a splash of buttermilk if available, or water mixed with a little vinegar to activate the soda. These biscuits rose fast, baked in 15 minutes, and came out lighter than anyone expected given the simplicity. They lacked the tangy depth of sourdough, but they filled the same role, something warm and bread-like to soak up gravy and stew. A smart cookie always carried an extra tin of baking soda as insurance against the day the starter gave up. Number 11. Fried potatoes and onions. When the wagon restocked at a supply point or passed near a settlement, the cook would buy potatoes and onions by the sack, sliced thin and fried in beef tallow until the edges crisped golden. This was the one dish every cowboy loved without reservation. The potatoes turned creamy inside their fried shells, and the onions softened into sweet, caramelized ribbons. A 20-pound sack of potatoes cost about 50 cents, and onions were even cheaper. The cook would serve them alongside whatever meat was on hand, and the men would scrape the skillet clean. Potatoes could not last the whole drive since they sprouted and softened in the heat. So fried potatoes meant the supply wagon had just come through, and that alone was reason to celebrate. Number 10, beef tongue. A fresh-killed steer produced one tongue weighing 3 to 4 pounds, and the cook who knew his business never let it go to waste. Simmered in salted water for hours until the tough outer skin peeled away. The meat beneath was tender, rich, and fine-grained, better than most cuts the cowboys were used to eating. Sliced thin and served cold the next day with mustard or pickled peppers, the tongue became sandwich meat that rivaled anything from a city deli. Some cooks pressed it into a pot and let the natural gelatin set it into a loaf. Tongue was the cook's reward, often claimed for himself before anyone else could ask, though a fair-minded cookie shared it with the crew. Its disappearance from modern American tables would have baffled any trail cook who knew its worth. Number 9, molasses pull candy. On the rare night when the herd was settled, the weather was calm, and the cook had thyme and sugar, he would boil molasses and sugar together until a drop hardened in cold water, then pour it onto a greased tin to cool. Cowboys would grease their hands with butter and pull the warm candy between their fists, stretching it into long ropes that lightened in color with each pull until it turned glossy and stiff enough to snap into pieces. It was entertainment as much as food, a social ritual that gave men something to do with their hands besides mend tack. The finished candy was hard, sweet, and lasted for days tucked in a shirt pocket. For cowboys who had not seen a town in 6 weeks, molasses candy was Saturday night. Number 8, biscuits and sorghum syrup. When molasses ran out, sorghum syrup took its place. Thinner and slightly grassier in flavor, sorghum was cheaper and easier to find in the southern supply towns where most drives began. The cook kept a tin jug of it on the wagon table, and cowboys would crack open a hot biscuit, pour sorghum into the steaming center, and eat it in 3 bites. The combination of salty, flaky bread and dark sweet syrup was the trail's version of breakfast pastry. Some men ate it at every meal. A gallon of sorghum cost about 30 cents and lasted a crew 2 weeks if nobody got greedy. Number 7, skillet peach cobbler. The story goes that a trail cook somewhere in the Indian Territory dropped a can of peaches into his biscuit dough by accident and baked it anyway. True or not, skillet cobbler became a legend. The cook would dump a can of preserved peaches, syrup and all, into a greased Dutch oven, spoon biscuit dough over the top in rough lumps, sprinkle sugar and a little cinnamon if he had it, then bury the pot in hot coals with more coals piled on the lid. 30 minutes later, the dough had baked into a golden crust over bubbling sweet fruit. Cowboys would line up with tin plates, scraping every last drop of syrup from the pot. Canned peaches cost about 20 cents a tin at a supply stop and were worth every penny when cobbler night came around. Number 6, frijoles refritos. The Mexican vaqueros who worked alongside Anglo cowboys on Texas drives brought refried beans to the chuck wagon and changed supper forever. The cook would take leftover pinto beans from the night before, mash them in a skillet with lard, and fry them until the edges crisped and the center turned smooth as paste. Topped with crumbled dried chili and wrapped in pan de campo, refried beans were a complete meal that traveled in a cowboy's hand while he rode. The technique was simple but required patience, since the beans had to cook down slowly without burning. Once the Anglo cooks learned the method, refried beans became standard on drives across the southern plains. Number 5, son of a gun in a sack. A variation on son of a gun stew, this version wrapped the chopped organs and suet in a cloth sack, tied it tight, and boiled it for hours like a savory pudding. The result was a dense, sliceable loaf of offal held together by rendered fat that could be eaten hot or cold. Cold slices went into saddlebags for the next day's ride, holding up in the heat better than loose stew. It was trail engineering, food designed for men who ate in the saddle as often as they ate at camp. Every piece contained a mix of heart, liver, and sweetbreads, delivering the same nutrition as the stew in a portable package. Number 4. Coffee gravy on biscuits. When the meat was gone and the beans were boring, the cook would brew extra strong coffee, thicken it with flour and bacon grease, and pour it over split biscuits. It sounds desperate because it was, but the bitter, smoky gravy delivered caffeine and calories in a single plate, and cowboys who had been in the saddle since before dawn ate it without complaint. The trick was getting the flour smooth and the coffee strong enough to taste through the fat. A good cook could make coffee gravy that was almost savory, almost rich, almost enough to make a man forget he had eaten the same thing yesterday. Number 3. Beef and marrow bone soup. When a steer was slaughtered, the cook would crack the long leg bones, drop them into the largest pot, and simmer them with water, onions, and salt for an entire day. The marrow melted into the broth, turning it golden and silky with a richness that no lean meat could provide. Whatever scraps of beef and gristle clung to the bones fell apart into the liquid, creating a soup that was both delicate and deeply nourishing. Cowboys recovering from illness or injury were fed marrow broth first. It was the trail's medicine, and modern nutritionists would call it a near-perfect recovery food. The bones cost nothing since they were waste from the butchering. The soup cost only time. Number 2. Chicken fried bacon. When the salt pork got tiresome and the crew started grumbling, the cook would take thick slabs of bacon, dredge them in seasoned flour, and fry them in deep fat until the coating turned golden and the bacon inside crisp to perfection. Served with cream gravy and biscuits, this was salt pork transformed into something a cowboy would actually look forward to eating. The flour coating mellowed the brine and added a satisfying crunch that plain fried bacon could never match. It used ingredients already on the wagon and took 10 minutes to prepare, but it felt like a completely different meal. A cook who could make the ordinary extraordinary was the most valuable man on the drive after the trail boss himself. Number 1. The full chuck wagon supper. On the best nights, when the weather held and the herd was calm and the supply wagon had recently come through, the cook would lay out a spread that covered every surface of that fold-down table. Sourdough biscuits fresh from the Dutch oven, chicken fried steak with cream gravy, pinto beans simmered since dawn, fried potatoes and onions, stewed dried apples, spotted pup for dessert, black Arbuckle's coffee strong enough to strip paint. Every man would fill his tin plate, find a patch of ground, and eat in the kind of silence that only deep satisfaction produces. The fire would pop and settle, the cattle would low in the distance, and for a few minutes, 1,000 miles from the nearest city, 12 men who smelled like dust and sweat and leather would sit in the glow of a mesquite fire and eat like kings. That full supper was not one dish. It was the whole chuck wagon working exactly as Charles Goodnight intended when he built the first one in 1866. Every item on this list came together on those perfect nights, and the men who lived through those drives never forgot the taste. Try one of these: the vinegar pie, the spotted pup, the pan de campo. Then come back and tell me which one earned its place on the trail. Drop your answer in the comments.